Beyoncé, even though she's, I guess, one of the biggest music stars ever, I find her music to be awful, unlistenable,
Same.
and just, quite honestly, just noise. It's not music.
He called Beyoncé's music disgusting. He mocked black women in power. And then, in front of thousands, Charlie Kirk's life ended in the most shocking way imaginable. But was he a fearless truth-teller or a man consumed by hate? Beyoncé stands today as one of the most influential and celebrated figures in global music history. Her voice, stage presence, and cultural impact stretch far beyond the bounds of entertainment. She has become a symbol of empowerment, artistry, and innovation. From her early days with Destiny's Child to her evolution into a solo powerhouse, Beyoncé's career has been marked by groundbreaking performances, record-breaking albums, and a fearless willingness to push creative and cultural boundaries. She is not just a singer, she is a storyteller, a cultural architect, and, for millions, a symbol of pride and possibility. And yet, despite this undeniable legacy, conservative activist Charlie Kirk chose to dismiss her body of work in terms so scathing they bordered on contempt. He didn't merely admit that her music wasn't to his personal taste. Instead, he used language designed to wound, branding her songs awful, unlistenable, and nothing more than noise. Finally, in the most cutting jab of all, he declared her art disgusting. These weren't the words of someone politely bowing out of a genre they don't enjoy. These were words meant to delegitimize, to strip away the artistry, and to reduce Beyoncé to something beneath serious consideration. Such language, when directed at an artist of her stature, goes far beyond the realm of subjective taste. After all, no one expects universal agreement about music. Art is inherently polarizing, and not every sound is for everyone. But there is a world of difference between saying, "This isn't my style," and mounting an outright attack. By framing her work not simply as unappealing but as fundamentally worthless and even revolting, Kirk wasn't just critiquing Beyoncé, he was, intentionally or not, sending a larger message about what and who he believes deserves respect. For many observers, this moment was not an isolated critique of pop music. Instead, they saw it as part of a much broader pattern. Again and again, Kirk has positioned himself not only as a commentator on politics, but as a cultural gatekeeper, attempting to decide which voices should be elevated and which should be dismissed. And time after time, his most venomous criticisms seem to fall on women, people of color, and creators who dare to push beyond traditional cultural margins. Beyoncé, as a figure, embodies precisely that kind of boundary. Her music often celebrates Black culture, womanhood, and resilience. Albums like Lemonade and Renaissance don't just deliver hits, they spark conversations about race, gender, identity, and history. Her performances at events like Coachella dubbed Bayshella were not simply concerts, but cultural landmarks, filled with symbolism, references, and tributes to historically Black colleges and the wider African diaspora. In this way, Beyoncé has used her platform not only to entertain but also to amplify stories and traditions often sidelined in mainstream culture. To call that work noise is, in the eyes of many, to trivialize entire histories, narratives, and communities. The choice of words matters. Dismissing her artistry as disgusting doesn't just belittle her, it echoes a much older rhetoric, one historically used to devalue the cultural output of marginalized groups. Jazz, blues, hip-hop, reggae, all genres that emerged from communities of color were at one time dismissed by critics as chaotic, immoral, or dangerous noise. What is celebrated today as America's greatest cultural export was once demonized using the very language Kirk employed against Beyoncé. That's why his comments landed with such weight. For millions of fans and cultural observers, they weren't just about personal taste. They revealed something deeper, a worldview where certain cultural voices are systematically minimized, ridiculed, or treated as illegitimate. This is why people reacted so strongly, not because a single conservative activist disliked a pop star, but because his words carried with them echoes of long-standing cultural battles over who gets to define art and whose voices are heard. It's also worth noting that Beyoncé's place in the cultural imagination is about more than music. She has become a symbol of female empowerment, often celebrating independence, resilience, and power in a way that challenges patriarchal norms. Songs like Run the World Girls and Flawless double as anthems for gender equality. For many women, Beyoncé represents not just entertainment but the articulation of struggles and aspirations they live every day. In this context, Kirk's attack on her was read by some as not just dismissive of her sound, but dismissive of the very ideals she embodies. Critics pointed out that Kirk's choice of target wasn't random. Why Beyoncé, of all artists? Why label her work disgusting, when her global reach is rivaled by only a handful of performers alive today? Some argue that the answer lies in her power. Beyoncé's ability to command attention across race, gender, and generational lines makes her a cultural force who challenges the very hierarchies Kirk often defends. To dismiss her so harshly is, in effect, to try and undermine the legitimacy of her influence. At the same time, his remarks served another purpose: to stoke outrage. Figures like Kirk thrive in the world of hot takes and viral controversy, where strong language generates clicks, shares, and debate. Calling Beyoncé disgusting guaranteed headlines. It positioned him as the provocateur, willing to say the unsayable. But while this tactic may have earned him attention, it also reinforced the perception that his critiques disproportionately target marginalized voices. Consider the contrast. Kirk rarely uses this kind of language against mainstream white male performers, even when he disagrees with them politically. His harshest fire has consistently been reserved for women, minorities, and those who openly celebrate diversity or challenge traditional norms. Beyoncé, in this sense, was not the exception but the continuation of a well-established pattern. The backlash to his comments was swift. Fans defended Beyoncé's artistry, pointing to her decades-long career, her critical acclaim, her historic Grammy wins, and her trailblazing performances. Cultural critics noted that to call her work unlistenable was to ignore the millions worldwide who find meaning, inspiration, and empowerment in her songs. For them, Kirk's words weren't just inaccurate, they were an erasure of the joy and strength Beyoncé's music provides. And then there's the matter of credibility. Critics were quick to note that Kirk, who built his platform as a political commentator rather than a cultural critic, has little authority to pass judgment on artistry at this level. His dismissal of Beyoncé rang hollow when weighed against her achievements: sold-out stadium tours, critically acclaimed albums, and an influence that has reshaped music and culture across decades. By comparison, his credentials in the world of music are non-existent, leaving many to view his comments as less a critique of art and more a reflection of bias. This incident, in the larger scheme, illustrates the power of cultural symbols in America's ongoing political divides. Beyoncé, like many prominent figures in entertainment, has become more than an artist. She is a symbol, often politicized whether she intends it or not. For her fans, she represents excellence, empowerment, and cultural pride. For critics like Kirk, she represents a challenge to the narratives they want to sustain about who holds authority in culture, and whose voices should be amplified. Ultimately, Kirk's comments tell us less about Beyoncé's music, which continues to resonate globally, and more about the deep fractures in American cultural discourse. His words were a reminder that battles over politics and identity are no longer confined to legislatures or campaigns. They spill into art, music, and everyday expressions of culture. When a voice as powerful as Beyoncé's is dismissed so contemptuously, it's not just about music, it's about who gets to define the cultural narrative of a nation. So, when people heard Kirk call Beyoncé disgusting, they didn't just hear a man criticizing a pop star. They heard the echo of centuries of dismissal, erasure, and devaluation of marginalized voices. They heard the continuation of a pattern where certain figures are reduced to caricatures, their work stripped of legitimacy simply because it challenges entrenched norms. And that, more than the insult itself, is why his words ignited such outrage. Because in the end, Beyoncé's music is not going anywhere. Her artistry has already secured her place in history, and her cultural influence continues to grow. The real question is not whether Kirk's comments will tarnish her legacy. They won't. The question is what his words reveal about the broader cultural struggle in America today. Was this just another attempt to grab headlines by taking down a global icon? Or was it part of something much deeper, reflection of how some voices still try to police the boundaries of art, culture, and identity in the 21st century? Either way, his words will be remembered not as an honest critique of music, but as a stark reminder of the cultural battles still raging beneath the surface of American life.
Reid and Michelle Obama and Sheila Jackson Lee and Ketanji Brown Jackson were affirmative action picks, we would have been called the... But now they're coming out and they're saying it for us. They're coming out and they're saying, I'm only here because of affirmative action. Yeah, we know you do not have the brain processing power to otherwise be taken really seriously. You had to go steal a white person's slot to go be taken.
This wasn't merely about Beyoncé, it sparked a far larger reckoning. Critics argued that Kirk wasn't just chasing attention online, he was actively feeding the resentment and hostility tearing at the country's core. To them, he didn't just stir controversy, he weaponized it, spreading division and then cashing in while society absorbed the damage. And here's where the uncomfortable truth sits. His death, though undeniably tragic and unjust in its circumstances, doesn't erase the legacy he built. His public record remains filled with rhetoric many describe as steeped in prejudiced sexist remarks, racist undertones, Islamophobia, homophobia, and a long list of verbal attacks aimed at marginalized communities.
Never live in a society when you have an armed citizenry and you won't have a single gun death. That is nonsense. It's drivel. But I think it's worth it. I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year, so that we can have the Second Amendment to protect our other God-given rights. That is a prudent deal. It is rational. Nobody talks like this. They live in a complete...
The news hasn't stopped rippling across the country. Charlie Kirk, a high-profile conservative figure and a close Trump ally, was killed in a way that stunned both supporters and critics alike. It happened during an outdoor event at Utah Valley University, where thousands had gathered to hear him speak. Witnesses described the moment in vivid, horrifying detail. Kirk suddenly reached for his throat, blood spilling as he collapsed from his chair, while panic swept through the crowd. Some screamed and bolted, others froze in disbelief, unable to process the nightmare unfolding before their eyes. This was no ordinary disruption. Kirk had been addressing an audience of nearly 3,000 people, kicking off what was meant to be the first stop in a 15-city national tour for Turning Point USA, the organization he helped create. But midway through a Q&A, the atmosphere shifted instantly. He lurched forward, straining for breath, before toppling over as emergency crews rushed to his aid. He was transported to a nearby hospital, but the attempt to save him came too late. Investigators quickly revealed details that made the situation even more chilling. The fatal shot was traced back to the Lucy Center, a building overlooking the event, about 140 yards from where Kirk had been sitting. Police sealed off a section of the rooftop, and experts noted that such a distance fell well within the range of a trained marksman. Nothing about it seemed accidentally to appear deliberate, precise, and deeply unsettling. As the motive remains unknown, the fallout has been immediate and intense. For many, the killing isn't just a story about one man's death, it's another flashpoint in an already fractured nation.
For when it comes to pilots or surgeons, if I see somebody who is black, as I said on the show, I'm going to hope that that person is qualified. That's what I said, which of course is legitimate, because they're begging the question, we're not hiring based on merit anymore. We're hiring based on race.
News of Charlie Kirk's death broke first from none other than Donald Trump, who took to social media to honor the 31-year-old as both great and legendary. Within hours, Trump followed up with a video address from the White House, elevating Kirk as a martyr for truth and freedom. He also laid blame at the feet of the radical left, accusing their rhetoric of stoking the kind of hostility that made the attack possible. Utah's governor, Spencer Cox, echoed the gravity of the moment, framing the killing as a political assassination. His statement carried a warning. America's political climate has become so inflamed, so fractured, that the nation is now at a dangerous boiling point. Yet, beyond the tributes pouring in from political heavyweights, the public response has been far less unified. Online, voices are clashing, some mourning Kirk as a symbol of conservative courage, others unwilling to ignore the polarizing legacy he leaves behind. Online, reactions have been deeply divided. While some mourn Kirk's death, many others argue that he doesn't deserve sympathy, pointing to a long history of remarks that demeaned women, people of color, and marginalized groups. Critics note that this wasn't a one-off slip, it was a consistent pattern, and the evidence is everywhere. Take one example. On his own show, Kirk singled out four of the most prominent black women in America: MSNBC host Joy Reid, former First Lady Michelle Obama, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. He claimed their acknowledgement of affirmative action was proof they lacked the intelligence to succeed without it. He went so far as to mock Representative Sheila Jackson Lee directly, using her own words about affirmative action as ammunition to belittle her intellect. It wasn't just harsh, it was a calculated attempt to strip them of credibility. In front of his audience, what made those attacks even more glaring was the reality of these women's accomplishments. Joy Reid earned her undergraduate degree at Harvard. Michelle Obama graduated from Princeton and then Harvard Law. Sheila Jackson Lee studied at Yale and completed law school at UVA, and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson holds both her undergraduate and law degrees from Harvard. Their academic credentials are ironclad, especially in contrast to Kirk himself, who attended Harper College for just one semester before dropping out. That contrast became a rallying point online, where critics called out not only the hypocrisy but also the deeper implication in his words that prestigious roles are inherently reserved for white people. But that wasn't the only example. Over the years, Kirk made a string of remarks that many found not just offensive but openly prejudiced. He once suggested that a moronic black woman in customer service might only have her job because of affirmative action. He mocked marginalized identities with lines like, "If you're an NBA pot-smoking black lesbian, do you get treated better than a U.S. Marine?" He even trafficked in dangerous stereotypes, claiming that prowling blacks were targeting white people for fun in urban America. One of his most infamous comments resurfaced recently, where he said, "If I see a black pilot, I'm going to be like, boy, I hope he's qualified." That remark, made during a panel discussion about airline diversity programs, sparked outrage all over again, and when challenged by a black audience member on whether such statements were irresponsible, Kirk didn't backtrack. He escalated. He went as far as to call Martin Luther King Jr. awful and claimed America made a huge mistake in passing the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. Gasps from the crowd captured just how far outside the bounds of normal debate his rhetoric had drifted. And then came the moment that shocked even many of his own supporters. In a debate on reproductive rights, Kirk was asked if he would support forcing his own 10-year-old daughter to carry a pregnancy conceived through assault. Without hesitation, his answer was chilling. Yes, the baby would be delivered. That single statement reverberated online, cementing for many critics the view that his ideology wasn't just controversial, it was cruel. For many critics, Charlie Kirk's rhetoric wasn't just harsh, it was heartless and dangerous, a reflection of just how far his worldview had drifted into extremes. And he didn't confine those views to politics alone. When pop superstar Taylor Swift got married, Kirk turned his attention on her. Instead of congratulations, he issued a command: reject feminism, submit to your husband, you're not in charge. He went on to argue she should have more children than houses, mocked her for prioritizing her career into her 30s, and even suggested marriage might turn her into a conservative hardliner. To her fans, his comments came across not as commentary but as a lecture dripping with condescension and attempt to put her back in her place. From there, Kirk's targets shifted against to immigration. He claimed America's golden age coincided with decades when immigration was all but halted, and the foreign-born population reached its lowest point. He called for a return to that model, accusing Democrats of wanting America to collapse and celebrating a country that, in his words, was becoming less white. Critics noted that these weren't abstract policy positions. He was openly promoting the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, a narrative that has fueled violent extremism. Religion, too, became a flashpoint. On multiple occasions, Kirk described large Muslim communities as a direct threat to America. While he wrapped his comments in the language of national security, his words left little doubt. He portrayed Islam as incompatible with Western civilization, even going so far as to call it the sword the left is using to slit the throat of America. Each statement sparked online firestorms, but taken together, they painted a consistent picture. His vision of America as a fortress of whiteness and Christianity, defended under the guise of intellectual debate. That's why his attack on Beyoncé struck such a nerve. For many, it wasn't just a throwaway insult at a pop star. It was part of a lifelong pattern, loud, dismissive, and consistently hostile toward women, minorities, and marginalized voices. With his life ending so suddenly and violently, people aren't only asking what he said about Queen Babe, they're asking how history will remember him. Was he a fearless truth-teller, or a man who dressed prejudice up as principle? The divide is striking. Supporters like comedian Terrence K. Williams rushed to defend him, blasting critics for trying to smear his legacy. Williams even shared a personal story. Back in 2019, Kirk spent his own money to cover travel costs for hundreds of black students so they could attend a White House event. Flights, hotels, expenses. He picked up the bill, ensuring no one was left out because of financial barriers. For Williams, that generosity was unforgettable. He credited Kirk with giving him, and countless others, opportunities they'd never have had otherwise, closing his tribute with, "I'm going to miss him so much." And so the paradox of Charlie Kirk's legacy comes into focus. On one side, years of rhetoric steeped in sexism, racism, and hostility toward marginalized groups. On the other, loyal defenders who see him as a bold, uncompromising voice, unafraid to speak his truth. Which side history leans toward remains an open question. Was he a provocateur hiding prejudice under the banner of free speech, or a cultural warrior who simply refused to bend? And when it comes to that infamous swipe at Beyoncé, do you see it as just another example of toxic commentary or proof that, love him or hate him, Charlie Kirk was always willing to say the unsaid?